agenda in.
Great. So Anne's included a little bit of a sort of an agenda for us with some rough times and how we're doing this. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully the technology all works for us. And hopefully everyone can hear all of us okay. So let's see. This will give you the title for sure. So I'm hoping everyone can see that. Interrupting the Canadian nuclear industry's greenwashing, brought to you by the Council of Canadians, mostly the Mississippi-Ottawa Valley, but contributions from across the country. So we're grateful for that. Our sort of priorities, as you all know, as a council, are these sort of bullet points that inform what we do, and Anne's going to speak to that in a little bit. But I think the overriding thing here is that essentially this issue of nuclear and nuclear waste particularly interacts with and affects all of these things that we do. So while nuclear may not be, or have been at least, a main priority of the Council of Canadians, it's certainly interwoven into all of the other priorities that the Council has on its sort of mandate and mission. So we thought that that was important to point out. At this point, and if you're ready, I'm going to just sort of hand over things to you and let you sort of go from there. And I will try to keep up with you on the slides. So this is Ann Pohl taking it from here for now.
Okay, so the primary purpose of this webinar is to brief you on what the industry has been up to as they realize that we're not going to be just sort of, all of us are not just going to sit back and allow the Department of Natural Resources to come up with a fluffy plan that's a policy plan that says almost nothing. And we continue to mobilize in our own communities, a lot of us, and with our allies around the DGRs, making sure that we can try and have something that's safe for putting nuclear waste into some kind of protected area, as well as the NSDF, the near surface disposal facility up here in Chalk River. And so, the work on the SMRs and the approvals for LaPro and Cameco, and just there's one thing in another. We're going to go through that, and we're going to see how the industry has been mobilizing and what their greenwashing campaign is about. That's the part that I'm about to do. After that, we'll be getting into some of the details of some of these projects that I've just mentioned, but we'll also be talking in particular about our what we think needs to be in the policy. And then we'll share what we think we can do to try and influence how the policy finally turns out, because it's only a draft at the moment. So yeah, the next slide. I just want to start you with the basics of radioactivity, because and I see I put some stuff there that I shouldn't have put there, but anyway, it's a slide that needed work. So anyway, there's three types of radioactivity. There's alpha, beta, and gamma. And in your average pile of nuclear waste, you're going to find probably some of each, because one of the things that happens is that nuclear waste decays, and as it decays, it keeps generating energy and turning into different things until finally all the half-lives have started to dwindle down. But the alpha emitters are things like naturally occurring uranium. The beta particles can damage eyes and skin, but their main danger is internal. That's something like tritium, which is fairly common up here at the top of the Ottawa River. And then the gamma rays are the ones that can kill you instantly. Cobalt 60 generates gamma rays. So does a lot of the other different kinds of nucleids and nuclear waste that comes out of core reactors. So and as you can see the illustration here how they penetrate. So that just gives you an idea that there's three kinds. This slide here shows you on the right, it shows you that globally, in 1996, there were 438 reactors producing 17% of the global electricity. And in 2019, there were a few more reactors, but they were only producing 10% of the global electricity. So, and that's because basically nobody wants to live next door to a nuclear power plant or nuclear waste, because in particular, nuclear waste sites can emit all three types of radioactivity, and different parts of the nuclear power plant will also emit all three types of radioactivity. So the industry has had no growth in Canada for decades. The last plant built was Darlington. It finished in 1993, 5 years late, with a $10 billion cost overrun. It started at $4 billion and worked up to almost $14 billion. So it's sink or swim time for the industry. And from the government's point of view, it's also a big issue because Canada is basically a resource extraction economy. For better or for worse, at this point, we don't manufacture much. So the government's concerned that you know, we keep the uranium industry going, I think. Next slide. Okay, so there's been one of the things that's happened in the last 6 months or so, or maybe a little bit longer than that, is increasingly hard pressure and disregard of issues at the local level. And in terms of disregard, the Mississauga First Nation band on the north shore of Lake Huron tried to slow down and request some things from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, request that some things be addressed regarding the Cameco, formerly El Dorado refinery and incinerator plant right next to, like a kilometer from their territory. They were requesting a 10-year relicensing, and the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, granted it to them and ignored almost all of the Indigenous issues, which included community health issues, cultural rights violations, inadequate consultation, and more. Perhaps one of the reasons that happened is because the Cameco produces about 20% of the global supply of uranium. So that's going to be really important to Canada, that trade keep going, and that it not get interfered with. So on the issue of hard pressure, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization it calls itself a nonprofit, but it's actually a consortium of all the nuclear power producers, most of which are trying to operate at least as best they can on a profit-making basis. So they're not really a nonprofit, but they got incorporated as a nonprofit to push for something called a deep geological repository, where the most toxic of the waste that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years and comes from the core of the reactors could be buried. And they have 2 possible sites left out of more than 10, I think 14 that they started with originally. One's in Teeswater in South Bruce County, over on the south end of Lake Huron. And the other's in the Lake Revelle area between Ignace and Wabigoon First Nation. And that area, I don't have the map here, but it's all water. I mean, anywhere you look, it's water. So, and I think there's 4 or 5 watersheds that are kind of connected to the area where that possible DGR might go. So when NWMO goes into an area like this, they often omit crucial risk information in their community messaging, like stray radiation possibilities, and also the likelihood that the area will become regionally stigmatized for having nuclear burial of nuclear waste, major nuclear waste there. So communities need to know these and more facts. In South Bruce, there's been a lot of courting of by NWO and a lot of path oiling money. And up here in Renfrew County, there's a different situation with the near surface disposal facility where we're seeing that local municipalities are really being pushed to express support for the NSDF through the Renfrew County Council. And the main strategy of CNL is to avoid talk about the proposed dump there, but simply to remind people that CNL is the primary economic engine for this region. It provides jobs and that sort of thing, spin-off of economic advantages, that sort of thing. So let's go to the next slide. Another thing that happened in the last few months is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which I just spoke about, produced 2 documents, a transportation policy and a framework document. In sum, to us and our allies in Nuclear Waste Watch, both these documents look like a public relations effort to make it appear that they've consulted the public. They don't have content to them. They don't answer questions. They don't address issues. So this map here shows the numbers 1 and 2 are the 2 possible sites remaining for the DGR, for the deep geological repositories. The other purple numbered ones are the places where the high level reactor stuff is sitting waiting to be, shipped to them whenever that happens. So the transportation policy is basically about how the stuff would get there to that site, either one of those 2 sites, should they be allowed, should NWMO be allowed to, by the community, to set up their deep burial thing there. And they're talking about probably up to 50 years just to clear what's already there. Of course, during that period of time, more will come. Next slide. So industry's coming on strong from all corners. This is a demonstration that some of their people had. The next slide. There's 3 groups that have become publicly evident in the past year as the industry's trying to gear up the presence of there being some community license, some social interest or social license for what they're planning to do. There's a group called Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which had their first sort of step out in terms of social media stuff in November. And they promote themselves as scientists, doctors, engineers, energy experts, and environmentalists who believe that nuclear energy must be part of Canada's path forward on climate change. So that's one piece, as we'll see in a minute, of the Greenwashing Campaign, that we need more nuclear energy to deal with climate change. Canadians for Nuclear Energy is part of the international network Stand Up for Nuclear, which claims that it gets no industry funding, but it gets funding from unnamed philanthropic organizations. And anybody familiar with how these major corporations operate realize that most of them have in-house charitable foundations. We can't trace, actually no one's able to trace where they're getting their money from, Stand Up for Nuclear, but it's assumed that by our allies, that the money is coming from industry charitable foundations. And then the other group that's recently emerged is the Canadian Nuclear Workers Council. It's actually been around for a while, but it's stepping out and stepping up its public presence about being concerned for the SMRs in particular. Go ahead. Next slide. Okay, so in the middle of all of this, the MP, the Bloc Québécois MP, Madame Monique Posé, did manage to get the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainability to set up a series of 4 hearings, 4 sessions and hearings on nuclear industry governance in Canada. Because industry's lobbyists are bombarding federal politicians with their greenwash talking points, which I'll summarize shortly. The hearings are now complete. Unfortunately, although the ministers of Environment and Climate Change Canada and also Natural Resources Canada were asked to attend this standing committee hearings, they chose not to. And the majority of the standing committee was in the thrall of the industry and its messaging. On the plus side, there were two presentations from Indigenous leaders that were extremely informative and spoke very strongly to the whole question of how consultation gets done and free, prior, and informed consent, and whether that hadn't happened, and also that we're in a time when we're supposed to be dealing with reconciliation and there needs to be changes. And there were also a small number of very excellent environmentally minded presentations. Most of the presentations came from industry or from academia supporting SMRs and that sort of thing. And there's the link there. I think probably somebody could, maybe somebody can copy that, or I can try and copy it later and put it in the chat. Next slide. Okay, so the next thing that happened, and this was very recently, the CNSC held a public relations event online. They must have caught wind of the fact that there's been a lot of criticism of them as being corporate captured. So they went to great lengths to explain that CNSC is an independent regulator and they showed numerous slides on how they do their decision making and what their staff do and what's their responsibility and what isn't their responsibility. But, and they basically made the argument over and over again, which is another one of industry's greenwashing points, that they are an independent regulator. But this is the same regulatory agency that has never rejected an industry licensing application, that lobbied for exclusion of most SMR most SMR proposals that are currently on the table being excluded from the Impact Assessment Act. And in order specifically to expedite the proponent's process. So they basically said in communications to the I believe Parliament, or maybe the Senate committee looking into the impact assessment, they said you know, that they felt that they should be exempted from this review, and that the CNSC would handle the review. They also have explained in their presentation that they have no responsibility for federal or provincial waste policy. They have responsibility for making sure that the proponent commits to doing certain things, but they have no responsibility for the management of it or the development of it. And so that excuses them from any responsibility for uranium mine waste upstream of their proponents, and also post-production industrial waste downstream. And that reinforces the false construct that industry and waste can be addressed separately. There's no way you can address them separately. Meanwhile, another indication of the integration of CNSC with industry is that the current CEO and president of CNSC recently transferred in from the Ontario Power Corporation, which is industry's one of industry's, well, the major provider of nuclear energy here in Ontario. All nuclear power plants are next to major waterways. This one happens to be La Pro. Next slide. So more relentless pressure. 3 applications being pushed through this spring are located on important waterways. That would be La Pro on the Bay of Fundy. They have a relicensing application for an unheard of 25 years being pending. CNSC's already said that they're in favor of letting them have 20 years, which is still unheard of. The normal amount is 10 years. There's a March 28th, 22 deadline for comments to CNSC, and there will be a public hearing May 11th and 12th based on the applications that they get in by March 28th. The CNL application for the near surface disposal facility is on the, that's on the Ottawa River, basically. It's in the Ottawa River watershed, and it's right next to the streams and wetlands that feed into the Ottawa River. CNSC's already okayed it. The staff have already okayed it, but there's still going to be one final public consultation round, which boggles my mind. I assume it's intended to be pro forma, but hopefully it won't be. Hopefully we can get in there, file the applications to appear by April 11th. And there's a website there. And that hearing, I believe, is the end of May. I think it's May 31st, something like that. And then there's the one I mentioned earlier, the chemical refinery and incinerator, where that application got approved despite all the community concerns and historical knowledge sharing. And that's also, it's on the north shore of Lake Huron in the Great Lakes. So next slide. So here are the nuclear industry's 5-point, here is the nuclear industry's 5-point greenwashing campaign. The first point, a lot more nuclear electricity is needed to get Canada off fossil fuels and combat the climate crisis. And what's the experts in science, engineering, and economics say is no, that new nuclear development won't happen fast enough. And that seeing as they're talking about a new type of nuclear development, these supposedly smaller nuclear reactors, they're technologically definitely not certain enough, and they're too expensive. The second point is the nuclear industry is not an emitter, which is untrue. It has considerable upstream and downstream carbon emissions, even though there isn't a lot of carbon that actually comes out of the nuclear plants. And then there's its toxic waste, which is definitely an emission. Not the same kind, but it's a very serious kind of emission. Nuclear power generation makes a much smaller amount of waste than other energy industries. Believe it or not, this is a high point that they hit in all their documents and even in the federal arguments and throughout industry presentations at the standing committee. And my comment is size is immaterial here, but it makes a sweet, fluffy talking point to say that they have smaller packages of waste. Nuclear power plants are safe is the next one. They spend a lot of time on that one, except when they're not. Can anyone say Fukushima? And what about the threat of Ukrainian disaster? And escalating climate chaos adds probability of incidents. So it's hard to really argue that they're safe. They may be safe for the people who are working in them because they make sure that they are. So, it's a liability issue, among other things, also wanting staff to be able to work in them. And finally, the fifth point in their greenwashing campaign is that the nuclear industry is regulated by an independent commission of technical experts. This is the CNSC, in conjunction with the Federal Department of Natural Resources. So the public interest in community and environmental health is protected. And many Canadians consulted back when the federal government drafted the Impact Assessment Act say, no, that is not true. And it's also not true if you ask communities affected by the industry. Next slide. This is yours, Ian.
Yes, it is. And just to check, can everyone hear me okay? Just somebody yell out.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Mark. So yeah, so we're moving on. Thank you, Anne. Since this whole NRCan's announcement about fleshing out its 96 framework into an actual policy for addressing radioactive waste, et cetera, we've several chapters been involved in pulling all this information together and trying to put it into sort of simple, comprehensive language. And the network, the Nuclear Waste Watch network of experts and allies has done the bulk of this, and that's a really good site to go to. So lots of analysis there, some proposals, and in this slide presentation, where most of the material has come from either the Nuclear Waste Watch or their individual members. And the council is really indebted to those individuals who keep doing this work, and some of them for decades and decades. Some of them are here tonight. So a big shout out, a big thank you there. And I always sort of wonder what the nuclear industry thinks. Do you think these volunteers are doing this sort of out of the goodness of their heart, and if there's no reason to do it? They're doing it because they're concerned. So a quick run through of our federal radioactive nuclear management policy, or our 10 priorities as sort of accumulated by all these different folks and different allies and agencies. So number one, protecting the water. No transporting of waste on waterways. Overall, the highest priority must be to protect the water, regardless of location, design criteria, construction, all of that sort of thing, which is a pretty big deal for the Council of Canadians in particular. Second point, removing NRCan's conflict of interest due to its double mandate to promote the nuclear industry and at the same time protect the public from the hazards of the industry, right? There's an inherent conflict there. Resource development is NRCan's work. So protection of community and environmental health from industry toxics must come under the mandate of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we need to separate those two things out. Ending all federal government taxpayer subsidies to the industry in order to increase the investment in real renewables and true renewables. Number 4, no importing of radioactive waste from other countries. And that's one of the arguments, is that we can do all this good stuff with storing our radioactive waste, so we can also make money essentially off of importing it from other countries, which is kind of mind-boggling, but that's what the industry is saying. And so we're basically saying no to that. No plutonium extraction, reprocessing, or pyroprocessing of radioactive fuel wastes. So those are the first 5, and they're fairly straightforward, as it were. The next 5 sort of require a little bit more explanation. So we're going to go through those as quickly as we can. And this is at some point where folks might want to throw a question if I don't address something here, stick it in the chat. We'll see if we can get to it later with one of our experts. That would not be me, by the way. So what we're suggesting is Canada needs an independent agency, an arm's length from government and industry, to oversee radioactive waste management and decommissioning. We don't have that right now. So there was a critical view of the CNSC's, was documented by an expert panel commissioned in 2016 to undertake this whole thing of public engagement and a consultation period, the draft document that ultimately became Canada's impact assessment legislation. The panel reported a perceived lack of independence and neutrality because of the close relationship CNSC has with the industries it regulates. And the term regulatory capture was often used by participants. So, and the panel continued, and this is sorry about that, quote from there: public trust and confidence is crucial. Without it, an assessment approval will lack the social acceptance necessary to facilitate project development. The erosion of public trust in the current CNSC assessment process has created a belief among many interests that the outcomes are illegitimate and preordained, and that there is no use in participating in the review process. The consequence of this is a higher likelihood of protests and court challenges, longer timeframes to get to decisions, and less certainty that the decision will actually be realized. In short, the absence of social license. So picking up on that sort of theme, really pushing for this independent agency that's arm's length from government and industry. These are just some additional points from the Nuclear Waste Watch folks around that need for an independent regulator. So I'll let folks read those. I won't bother going through them right now. And again, this slide deck is available to folks if they're interested in it, and certainly the recording will be made available. So number 7, this I think is, in my mind, possibly one of the biggest recommendations and biggest points. Radioactive waste must not be abandoned. Policy must stipulate perpetual care, including Heritage Canada documentation and updating, as well as ongoing monitoring in the form of rolling stewardship. And I certainly first heard of this concept from Dr. Edwards, Dr. Gordon Edwards, and makes imminent sense that we can't essentially abandon our nuclear waste in whatever. Right now, the deep geological repositories seem to be the sort of flavor of the day, but that essentially is abandoning them. and we don't know how that's going to work out. So the recommendation here is some form of rolling stewardship where we document. We can access the things, and when and if a better solution comes somewhere down the road through technology or whatever, we can then deal with the radioactive waste that we've got in some sort of rolling stewardship storage. Number 8, people's right to know and to consent and to enjoy quality of life. There's a need for the government and industry to be open, transparent in the management of that waste and its transportation. Traceability of those materials is also a key requirement for public safety and health. And we're seeing that play out now in the sort of mixed messages and changing messages that we're getting about COVID. That same sort of issue is inherent in the waste industry. The difference here is they're just not telling us anything. There needs to be transparency. There needs to be openness on the government's part, and it's much easier to do if they have an independent agency doing that. Diligent, effective oversight and accountability of the industry is essential. So it means that the industry can't regulate itself, essentially. Use of the precautionary principle. First, do no harm. Adopt that precautionary measure when scientific evidence about an environmental or human health hazard is uncertain and the stakes are high. Right? That's basic sort of precautionary know-how. And Indigenous peoples and Canadians have the right to access information, to engage in that decision-making and to know the risks. So that is sort of the recommendation. Further around particularly the Indigenous rights, expanding the rights of Indigenous peoples, because so many nuclear industries of the nuclear industry sites are in or next to Indigenous territory. And explicitly under Article 29 of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it states states shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. And there's a whole bunch. We could spend the whole night just on this one issue, essentially. This is just a highlight of, at least 9 resolutions from other Indigenous political entities expressing their concern about this sort of thing. You can see here, they're from across the country. And below them, in that very hard to read, is other commentary about some of the issues that they're bringing forward. And the whole sort of spirit of reconciliation, we're calling it, is to try and get that information on the nuclear industry and the waste issues that are existing. Right now, that process is not working to safeguard the rights of the Indigenous peoples, just plain and simple. What we're suggesting is that to gain that sort of full, valid, and respectful knowledge, proponents and the regulatory agency staff need to make use of cross-cultural competency learning opportunities. These should be made available to all of the folks working with Indigenous nations through the new arm's length regulatory agency. And some of that refers back to some of the commentary made by the chiefs that were presenting in front of the committee. And they did a really good job of explaining how that process is not working for them right now. So all of those parties need to sit down together and co-design a sort of a compatible, valid consultation project at a minimum. And then finally, next to last one, a moratorium on new nuclear generation development. So this waste remains toxic in perpetuity. Some of these nuclear waste don't decay to a safe level for hundreds of thousands of years, as you all know. The industry doesn't really discuss this directly, but their own estimates say it'll take at least 50 years to clear the existing inventory of high-level wastes from the reactor cores. And that's the existing waste that's already here in temporary storage. And of course, over those 5 decades, more is going to get generated. So the Council of Canadians is advocating for a total moratorium on any new uranium mining, refining operations, and the construct of new generation plants. And these, again, are more points to sort of back those things up that are coming from the Nuclear Waste Watch experts and allies who are working on this. Ban the in-situ decommissioning piece. Immediate decommissioning should be the preferred strategy, not shifting that burden onto future generations. So there's a bunch of these additional points that I'm not going to take a whole lot of time because I'm very conscious of the time. So I want to keep moving through these and get to the last of the recommendations here. Yeah, I won't bother on that. So the last of the recommendations are around the waste management policy that must address the toxic legacy and practices of uranium mining and milling. This includes seemingly abandoned tailings ponds and soils. And even if this requires that sort of negotiation between the jurisdictional issues, what's federal and what's provincial, and how are First Nations and Indigenous peoples involved, all of those types of thorny issues, but that needs to get worked out in order to ensure that this toxic legacy gets dealt with. And that's the legacy from the actual upfront mining and milling, those types of issues. And to that effect, what I'd like to do now is hand this over for a few minutes to our resident mining and milling expert in the crowd. We have Ken Collier here. He's spent decades working in and around this stuff, and he'll explain a little bit about his experience and his thoughts on the thing. So Ken, if you want to unmute yourself, you can take over from here for a bit, and we'll get your map up in a second as soon as you tell me.
Okay, thank you very much to the previous speakers. Mining is one of the topics about radiation and waste that usually lies in the background. Most of what we know about nuclear waste is about the product of energy production in the nuclear energy generators, largely in Ontario and Eastern Canada. A lot of the mining of uranium takes place out of most public site. In Canada, most of it is found in northern Saskatchewan and in the Northwest Territories. If you're able to put up the slide about the map now, that would be handy. I hope that you can make that big enough with your own computer to be able to see it better. But if you see that rather orange patch, more or less in the middle of the map, where the center of it probably would be where the boundary of Alberta and Saskatchewan meets the Northwest Territories, that's where most of the heavy-duty current mining takes place. And some clever person is pushing the stylus around to show us where that is. Historically, the earliest mining was done in the Northwest Territories at Beaver Lodge and in Port Radium. That was hard rock underground mining by tunneling, blasting, drilling, and that sort of thing. And in those days, following the Second World War, the ore was taken raw, mostly by truck and barge, and by railway to Ontario, where it went to, I believe, a small town called Bancroft, where the milling took place in those days. But uranium mining, particularly in the early days, did not produce very high quality milled uranium or something that you could use to make energy or bombs. Most uranium in the world hovers around 1% of uranium. So if you had 100 pounds of rock, only about 1 pound of it would be uranium. And so the uranium has to be extracted from it. In more recent decades, particularly starting in the 1960s, open pit mining became possible in northern Saskatchewan when they discovered uranium underground. Some of the pits for mining uranium measure more than 1 kilometer across at their open mouth. And some of them are possibly through as much as 300 meters deep. Open pit mining like that is done there because the uranium in a lot of the mines in northern Saskatchewan is far richer. The richest one in northern Saskatchewan has 23% uranium. So rather than just 1 pound of uranium out of 100 pounds of raw rock, about 23 pounds of uranium comes out of the richest one. Most of them hover somewhere in the mid-teens as a percentage of the rock that is mined. Most of those mines either have a mill at them or are close enough that the raw ore can be taken to the mill where it's treated with heavy-duty acid to extract the uranium. Most of the acid goes to burning away the rock around them, and the product then is called yellow cake. It looks like yellow chalk dust. Most of the time it is moved in kegs made of stainless steel, and if you know what a gasoline or oil drum looks like, those kegs are roughly half the size of one of those drums. A lot of the movement of that yellow cake takes place now by truck heading south from the northern Saskatchewan locations and eventually either continues by truck to Ontario or is loaded onto trains. Without getting too deeply into the transportation part of mining and milling, the industry claims that these drums of yellow cake are virtually indestructible. They run through a lot of tests and they give us a lot of news about how these tests are done to impress us about how strong the containers are. So the uranium mining that I've been talking about now is well known around the world, mainly because Canada's uranium is so much richer than that found in almost everywhere else in the world. There are larger uranium mines in Australia and in Asia, and there were some in Africa as well. Larger meaning larger in area, but their uranium is much lower grade than we produce here in Canada. I think that's probably all I should need to say right at the moment, but I did think that it was important to mention that all of this mining that goes on leaves behind a trail of radioactive waste around the mine sites. If you were to go back to the slide that you saw before, the one that had the picture of the stream flowing down toward a lake, I think it's one before this. That is, this mine tailings had, that one, the picture with the stream heading toward a lake. I've been in scenes very much like that, where the water, open air water and the rain is carrying away highly polluted material from the tailings ponds. You can see all the dead trees in the background, and they've been killed off by the chemicals and the radioactive materials that are in them. In addition to the plants and that sort of thing, I've seen pictures of deformed animals, fish, and other vegetation that is almost certainly caused by the radiation and chemicals. So radioactive waste is bad enough. Then you add to it all the chemical waste that goes with mining and milling, and you have a very bad scene. I could go on, but I think I'll stop there. I think the point is made. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That was excellent. What you're seeing on your screen now is just another graphic, courtesy of Gordon Edwards. Some of the reasons to worry about the mines and the milling, that sort of, and refer to it as the upstream waste and the upstream end of the whole process. So we'll move right along. Ava Shasharel, I'll be forever in your debt for not being able to.
Pretty close, pretty good.
Yeah, thank you. And Eva has taken on the whole project around the near surface disposal facility that's being proposed for up our way at the Chalk River site. So I'll let her take over from here for a few minutes.
Thank you. Right, so this will get a little bit into what the government and your tax dollars are currently planning to do with a very large volume of radioactive waste that comes from our federal nuclear activities since the Second World War. To locate this for you, I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, National Capital. The Chalk River site is right on the Ottawa River, about roughly 200 kilometers upstream, so kind of northwest. And you can see you can see there the river, the campus, this beautiful, majestic river, and this quite polluted, contaminated Chalk River Laboratories campus right next to it. So next slide, please. So the management of the federally owned nuclear sites, including all of the waste, was contracted to the private sector in 2015 by the Harper government. And so rather than direct management by the government, we now have these multinational corporations involved. And the contract with them really explicitly encourages finding some kind of cheap and fast way to dispose of the waste. So very soon after that was set up, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, which is this entity managed by the private sector consortium, proposed this near surface disposal facility at Chalk River. And it's a misnomer because that term typically would mean, in fact, below the surface, not very far, but below the surface. This instead is an above ground mound for which they've destined 1 million cubic meters of radioactive waste. And that includes waste not only that is already at Chalk River, but that would be moved, and indeed some of it already has been or is being moved around Canada to Chalk River. And as you can see in this little map here, these are all the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories sites. So in other words, they're federally owned, but managed by this corporate consortium. On the right-hand side, the little box in the middle is Chalk River, pointing to Chalk River. And wastes would be coming from Gentilly, which you see just above that in Quebec, potentially from Port Hope, from Douglas Point, where there is, again, it was an experimental research site of the federal government. There's a defunct reactor there. And there's another defunct reactor and laboratories in Manitoba at White Shell Laboratories. And a lot of transport has already happened of low to intermediate level wastes from White Shell Laboratories to Chalk River. So I think in the interest, again, of sort of cheaper solutions, the idea was to consolidate and move this together to one location. And there's never been any public consultation on that concept. Next slide, please. So what is all of this waste at Chalk River? Well, Chalk River Laboratories were set up in around virtually 1945 as part of the nuclear weapons development program, essentially. of the Allies, and for the next couple of decades, continued experimentation and development of nuclear technology, but also produced a lot of plutonium for the American nuclear weapons program. So in addition to the two defunct reactors there, we have, there was a great deal of plutonium processing. So there's very contaminated site. In the 1950s, the world's first reactor meltdown, 1952 actually, was at Chalk River. This is a famous one you may have heard of, where Jimmy Carter was one of the young naval officers who was running in there. They could each only spend 2 minutes, etc., and they contained this meltdown. There was a reactor fire about 6 years later. Anyway, from those big accidents, reactor parts and all kinds of other radioactive material were just buried in the ground. So these trenches now constitute very toxic waste management areas, they call them. And that is a liability to the federal government of, in today's dollars, about $7 billion. What there have been in the process of doing the last couple of years is moving to take apart all of the old buildings that date back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, and all of that is also contaminated radioactive waste. So the main criticisms of the NSDF, or we like to call it just the giant radioactive waste mound, is that it's really using the wrong technology. Being above ground, it's really a sophisticated, if you like, landfill type of facility. And these, by international standards, should only be suitable for very low level and short-lived wastes. But we know from all the documentation from CNL that there are very long-lived wastes there. Again, it's just not the right kind of technology to be using for this type of mixed waste. It's a very bad location. You probably couldn't find a worse one. It's about 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River. As I mentioned, the area around it with wetlands and a lake are already very radioactively contaminated. But in addition, there are all these other toxins, like from dioxins to mercury. And the Ottawa River itself is kind of a fault line and a seismically active area. So there's also that issue of earthquake risk, and there's also very high water table. Citizen groups have also said that really it's the wrong objective that's being addressed, rather than it won't address really cleaning up the leaking land areas within the site. And finally, we're stuck with a very bad process, because rather than the Impact Assessment Act, we're under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012. And one of the frustrations is that the CNSC just has the final decision-making authority. It doesn't go to cabinet or have any of that kind of oversight. This illustration shows you kind of one of the worst aspects of the plan. And this is from, again, the environmental impact statement documents produced by the proponent. They call it the Bathtub Scenario. And this is a scenario sometime in the future when the top cover would be breached. But if the bottom liner is still intact, that means that the whole thing just fills up from rainwater and meltwater and overflows. And these colored bands you see are literally the contaminated water from the dump flowing right into this Perch Creek that flows up to the right of that. Again, about 1 kilometer away, flows right into the Ottawa River. And their plans say that it would take approximately 25 years for essentially all of the contaminants and waste in the dump to discharge if this scenario came about. Next slide, please. So the various groups, including the concerned citizens of Renfrew County and area, have collaborated and produced this wonderful report just come out on the flaws, errors, and omissions in the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's report. Now, their report recommends that this be licensed. So that's the position their staff have taken after 5-6 years of looking at the proposal and talking to the proponents. But it's riddled with errors and omissions. So it hasn't considered that within the mound will be these nuclear waste packages with which haven't really been adequately characterized or studied, but we know that they're full of highly toxic and long-lived materials. They're planning to build a pipeline, so they're going to have a water treatment plant to remove what contaminants they can from all the rain and snow melt that will go into the dump. That, of course, at a certain time in the future, they will, I think it's in the order of 100 years, will no longer do that, or may no longer do that. But while they are treating this water and not able to remove the tritium from it, they will be discharging that directly into that small lake that we saw. And from there, it flows right into the Ottawa River. They did not seriously consider alternative sites or other sites. I think this site was chosen for convenience because it is right there where the campus is and much of the waste is, but with its high water table and so on, it really is not suitable. Nor did they really seriously consider alternative types of facilities like a vault, cement vaults or underground, etc. And they even made a 1,000-fold error. They have a lovely chart that says, look, after 100 years, the radioactivity of this mound will be just like the rocks in the nearby, because there is some uranium in some of the nearby Canadian shield rocks, but they made a 1,000-fold error. So no, it's in fact going to be tens to hundreds of thousands of years before that radioactivity would ever decline to background levels. They're also, they also have a commercial side to their operations where they accept materials for disposal, including these cobalt-60 irradiators that are so much used in medicine and other kind of industry. We make them in Ontario, we export them around the world, and after a few years, they come back here for disposal. These are highly, highly radioactive, and they are, we know that there's going to be some quantity of them in the mound, along with all the lead that was used to shield the workers, because that's required with wastes that are this hot. But they haven't really looked at the risks to workers if there were accidents in the handling of these irradiators. Definitely the technology proposed doesn't meet international standards. And again, they haven't really addressed in the environmental assessment all these other hazardous wastes like arsenic, mercury, dioxins, PCBs, and so on. Next slide, please. There's also a very serious failure to consult with First Nations. As a result, the Kabeawak First Nation wrote to the Commission in January, I think late January, and asked that the licensing hearings be suspended until they can have a proper consultation framework. But the CNSC is forging ahead nonetheless. They wrote them a kind of waffly letter saying, well, yeah, but in the meantime, we'll, we're going to look at this, but in the meantime, we'll go ahead. The Kabeawak First Nation is part of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council, and the AAMTC actually had a funding agreement for studying this with the CNSC, and they withdrew as a result of how bad this process was. So they maintain that the CNSC has not discharged its duty to consult. And recently, MPs representing the Bloc, the NDP, and the Green Party, as well as quite a number of national and regional groups, issued a statement saying that for this and other reasons, the hearing should be suspended. Next slide, please. I think that slide was I think that slide came up twice. So there we are. So why do we mistrust the CNSC process? Many reasons. One that's been mentioned earlier was the conflict of interest that CNSC reports to Parliament via Natural Resources Canada. But it is the department also explicitly responsible for the nuclear industry and for really promoting its interests. So there's a terrible conflict of interest in how the Commission operates. They are not going to be holding separate environmental assessment hearings for this project. They've just folded them in and combined them with a licensing hearing, which really doesn't, adequately allow for the environmental assessment aspect to be dealt with by interveners. They there was, during the project description and scoping, there was tremendous number of submissions and input that were pretty much ignored. Because of the way they've combined the hearings, they're not having a separate comment period on the CNSC's environmental assessment report. So it was kind of 6 years of wait, and now hurry, hurry, hurry. And the assessment of the concerned citizens groups and others is that the CNSC failed to assess the project in an objective and scientifically credible manner. And again, as previously mentioned, the CNSC is viewed by many as a captured regulator. It even lobbied for the industry interests. It lobbied the government when the Impact Assessment Act was being developed to exclude small modular reactors below a certain size, and got what they asked for, I guess. And finally, the CNSC has never refused to grant a license. So I'm afraid we are pretty pessimistic, about the process. But nonetheless, many groups are preparing to intervene. The second part, the public part of the hearing, will be May 31st. And the deadline to submit that you want to intervene is April 11th. And for more information, I'm with the Ottawa chapter of Council of Canadians, and that's, maybe I can put these into the chat as well. That's our fairly primitive website, but you can find some more information there. And the Concerned Citizens website also has a huge cache of documents, including the flaws, omissions, and errors report that I mentioned. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, that was a ton of information. I'm scared we're overloading people. You're certainly overloading me, but thank you, Eva, for that sort of quick walk through nuclear history. It occurs to me as we're doing this wasn't planned, by the way, but it occurs to me that we're getting this sort of timeline, sort of continuum with first the mining, then the present of the reactors, and now we're going to have Gail Wiley come on to give us an update on small modular nuclear reactors, which is her area of expertise. And she's located in New Brunswick, where there's a big push on these, but they're also here at the Chalk River site as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Gail for the next few minutes to bring us up to speed on the whole sort of small modular nuclear reactor side of this. This is sort of the future of nuclear if the industry has its way. Go ahead, Gail. You may have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I've asked the staff, the council staff, to post a group of references that I provided, because I can't cover half the details in the 10 minutes. And so that should be a richer source of information. Okay, next slide. SMRs are not a good idea. First of all, they are designs only, so they don't exist, and they may never exist at grid scale. Prototype could not be ready before 2030 and very likely 2040, although OPG keeps saying they're going to have theirs ready by 28, in production by 28. Not. Anyway, they will never be cost competitive with renewables, because renewables are already cheaper and getting cheaper still, and nuclear is already more expensive and continuing to become increasingly expensive. The costs are going up. They use, most of them except the OPG one, will be using new fuels that are more enriched uranium than any other reactors. And of course, they'll also generate a new waste, and neither one of those is well known or understood of having been worked with. So that's a real problem. They will, of course, add to the existing nuclear waste for which there is no proven safe solution. And also 300 megawatts is not small. The Pro was 500 megawatts when it was built. So not is the right word for all of this. So why would we promote SMRs as new nuclear? And the key point is that that industry is dying worldwide. And that's reflected in the 2021 World Nuclear Industry Status Report by the industry's leaders themselves. And the lobbying about new models and new medical services and new everything else is in direct proportion to their desperation to save the industry. Anyway, that's in the world. But for Canada, Canada sells uranium, so we must love nuclear. Canada has nuclear armed partners, which are subsidized by the civil nuclear power. SMR fission heat can decarbonize the tar sands extraction. That's why Alberta just joined in. Also, they're seen as non-emitting power replacement for carbon producing fossil fuel power to get us to our net zero. And one of the references that you'll get in the chat is a nuclear baseload specialist who was the lead writer on the 2021 nuclear report. And he debunks that they are not a climate solution. And in New Brunswick, it's going to turn into an industry to produce these things and sell them worldwide. And it's going to boost up our economy and jobs, jobs, jobs. Next. Okay. Nuclear waste reprocessing is also not a good idea. First of all, it is not recycling. It is not a solution to accumulating new nuclear waste. It extracts only 1%, actually less than 1% of it is this plutonium that they extract for reuse. Now, volume-wise, it can go down a bit more, and that's in debate, but it is definitely not getting rid of the pile of stuff you've got. And then in the way they do it, it leaves it in a new mixed molten form for which safe disposal is not even known. So, but anyway, why would you promote such a thing when it's not a solution? Well, recycling sounds like a win-win for an expensive, toxic, not in my backyard nightmare. If they're going to be extending nuclear power with the new forms of it or refurbing the old fellas, then you're going to have a social license, and they can't get a social license until they start dealing with what do you do safely and surely with the existing nuclear waste before you produce any more. Also, decommissioning the aging reactors is another whole thing on the horizon, which will produce more and at different levels of radioactive waste, but it's increasing the pressure to find a solution. So they're basically grasping at straws when they promote this. Okay, how has this promotion of both the SMRs and the reprocessing been managed? Well, it's been managed by the industry lobby acting as partners to both levels of government and definitely behind our backs. It began in 2017 with a 6-month project called Generation Energy Dialogue. Now, I don't know if you ever heard of that, but to me, that was behind the back because I never knew what was going on. Anyway, the way they frame it in the government description of what came out of it was that it told NRCan, this process told NRCan that they needed to work together to realize the potential for SMRs, not whether or not to have SMRs, but a foregone conclusion. There would be some and just how they would work it out, which is absolutely appalling. Anyway, this juggernaut of stage managed out of public view began with a 10-month SMR roadmap project that purported to be an open consultation leading to partnerships. Well, it wasn't. It was basically all the players and all that chain of the nuclear industry, and then and the nuclear provinces who were already in it up to their necks, and then a few end users like heavy industry, of course, is interested in decarbonizing, and 1 or 2 remote communities, which would be off-grid, and Indigenous communities, not a lot of them. So it really was a captured process. And then they come out with the SMR roadmap, was released by government, and within less than 2 months, you had the 3 nuclear provinces signing up a memorandum of understanding to develop SMRs. They were already committed. It's just, and in 2020, Alberta joined because they could see the possibility of rescuing the tar sands by using the heat from a fission machine to melt the bitumen. And in 2020, December of 2020, then the SMR action plan, which gave each of these players in this nice little list, was given 2 or 3 roles of things they would do to make it all actually happen. And they said, and again, it was the same players, except that this time they added and said, well, we consulted academia and the civil society, and I never got invited. I don't think you did. I don't know who the civil society was. Academia has been bought out. UNB, McMaster, and Western, at the very least, probably others, will get funding for nuclear R&D. So they're hardly an independent consulting. Okay, enabling. One key behind the back move was the enabling legislation, the brand new Impact Assessment Act in 2019. Industry, and I think others have mentioned the CNSC itself, lobbied like crazy. And sure enough, the regulation is actually in a regulation. There's a thing called a designation list of the things that will have to go through full impact assessment. And guess what's not on it? SMRs are exempt, in a sense, essentially exempt, because they put it this way. Anyone that is small enough, that is 200 megawatts thermal, which would be about 70 electricity, doesn't need to have an impact assessment through the department. Or a bigger one is, as long as it's sitting on an existing nuclear site, it can be up to 900 megawatts thermal, which is about 300 megawatts electricity. Hello, Moltex, which is exactly 300. Now, the killing thing about this is they keep bragging it's all brand new technology. It's definitely, except for OPG, going to have more highly enriched uranium and processes that are still experimental. Why would you trust the impact assessments that was there for the old big nuclears, as if, well, you don't have to look at these new ones while you're bragging about the new ones? Okay, next slide. It's never been, the Liberal government has never had nuclear expansion on their election platforms the last 3 elections, which is why I got involved, because when it started to come out, I thought, this has never been offered in the elections, and the money's coming federally. This is just, I just felt stabbed in the back. And even in their latest one, where they call it a cleaner, greener future, there is no mention of nuclear. And they know very well that in the $8 billion fund, some of it can be tapped for R&D for nuclear. Okay, next slide. There's definitely going to have to be some private funding, venture capital, but that venture capital is what I think the governments are already doing with our public money, which is absurd. It's gambling. Anyway, and it's either in seed money or it comes afterwards. So Moltex has already gotten 55.5 million from government. And they're saying up front that they need 2.5 billion. And we know that that's a way underestimate from the experience of developing things. So they're going to have to fill in all of that with private money. I don't see anybody who's foolish enough to treat it as a good investment. So I don't know what's going to happen there. Bill Gates came up in 2008. He came up with his own billion, which is nothing to him, and said, well, I'm going to do this to develop TerraPower down in the States. And he openly said, of course, this is seed money for, I want to see some public money, and that's what needs to come. So he thinks he has the right to distort public money and funding. So anyway, he's got nothing to show for it. Since 2008, they're talking about building the TerraPower on a coal site, a closed down coal site. But anyway, we'll see. And of course, it has no approvals to build. Design approval is very, very tough. And NuScale was going to build 12 small ones in a cluster, and they are supported by power utilities out west in the States, hoping to get a source of good power. And I think they can see from the analysis done by 2 engineers recently that they are not going to be able to get power at a price they can afford to sell. And so a lot of them are backing out mile a minute before the building starts, after which it'd be much harder to back out. They'll have to get charged for a fee. Okay, next one, public funding emerges. In New Brunswick, to get ARC Nuclear, which is an American startup, which had already been given 20 million American for early stage development, and to get them to come to New Brunswick and set up in St. John, and then they gave another 5 million to Moltex, which comes from the UK, to build the small modular and a waste burner that with it extracting the doing the reprocessing to get plutonium. So then the next thing was that, oh, this huge amount of money was going to come from the federal government for Moltex, and it kept being dangled at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, dangled and dangled by Leblanc up the north. He's close buddy of Trudeau, and oh yes, it's coming, and it was pretty obvious it wouldn't come until the provincial government kicked in some fund, and so suddenly they made $20 million contribution to ARC Nuclear to get it going, and all of a sudden, within weeks, the big bundle of money, a total of 56 million, came from the federal government. 50.5 of it for Moltex, with the priority being to develop the reprocessing. Okay, in Ontario, 20 million was already given to Terrestrial Energy. That's an early startup, again, an American one out in Oakville. And OPG hasn't said it in dollar terms, but they've said they'd give a guarantee for the cost development of the GE Hitachi one. And just today, I received an article from the Durham newspaper that said OPG's got a contract for 32 million with somebody to do the site prep for that little SMR that they're going to build on the Darlington site, I gather. Okay, legislative oversight, there isn't any. It's never come to Parliament that they want to expand nuclear in Canada. And the real killer is they've never brought to Parliament the idea of doing plutonium extraction, which is what they've asked Moltex to do, which has proliferation risks from that reprocessing. As you pull out the plutonium, it's going to become an awful attractive product. And although Moltex says, oh no, it's not usable, there are a whole lot of senior US nuclear types who are saying, oh yes, it is, and they'll give you the exact formula of how it's produced. And the amazing thing is senior Trudeau was convinced by people like Carter and others who knew what the risk was. And it was convinced to have a ban. It's not in law, but it's a policy ban against doing reprocessing. And here's his son going ahead with it and ignoring those two letters, or as far as we know, ignoring the two letters. Okay, provincially, next slide. New Brunswick has never put forward a bill or a motion to ask for approval of spending money in doing SMRs. It has shown up when the Natural Resources Minister made statements in the legislature, and you could ask questions, and it is explicit in the 2021 budget, which had that money for ARC Nuclear to get their 20 million. Okay, next slide. This is the kind of somewhat hopeful thing that there is an evolving SMR narrative. Originally, all during the last government, before this one, Seamus O'Regan was in charge of, he was the Minister of Natural Resources, and he was just wildly enthusiastic. Every time he got a chance to talk about this, it was like part of his Star Wars thing. And he kept saying, there's no path to net zero without nuclear. And not everybody in the cabinet agreed. And Wilkinson was in the Environment and Climate at the time. He was interviewed by Maclean's magazine. And when he was asked, well, here's your colleague saying, is it true that there's no path to net zero without nuclear? And he had this terse short statement that said, there are some places where nuclear will be needed. And he got asked the same question again in the same interview, and he had exactly the same set of verbiage. And as one of my colleagues said, who's experienced in this kind of stuff, he was probably angry that Reagan got out ahead of him selling that stuff. Anyway, now Wilkinson is the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, and I think he's doing a reasonable job of doublespeak, because he'll say things like, oh, nuclear has to be part of the mix of things that we're looking at. So to me, it's not a heavy duty commitment. I think they know that no due diligence was done on this by the province or the feds, and they got themselves into something, and there's going to be egg on the face if they can't slide out of it. Now, Gilles Beau is probably the most likely to really hold the line, because he has a past reputation of being against nuclear, and he's got another nice piece of doublespeak when he was challenged at COP26 by one of those nuclear groups that Anne was mentioning. The guy had a camera with him, and this pro-nuclear type says, you know, what are you going to do to help with nuclear and this sort of thing? And he came up with a statement and said, well, it's not up to government to choose nuclear power. It has to be competitive. And of course, by now, and you'll see in these articles, it absolutely is not and will not be. So that is doublespeak for you're not going to have it. And lastly, reprocessing is now being worked on in the CNL laboratories in Chalk River, because they need to use the hot cells to do a bit of experimenting. So I expect that this money that Mr. Higgs thought was going to be spent in New Brunswick is being spent in Chalk River, and won't be too happy about that. And the letters from the open letter about proliferation was ignored. One of the things I should mention about motivation, and this is part of what's so behind the back. Early on, when they mentioned SMRs in New Brunswick and we started CRED, we wrote a letter to Higgs to say, please don't do this. Spend the money on renewables. We need it now to change. And the letter we got back was 2.5 pages long. Oh, you know, this and that, and all the climate stuff. And finally, in the last half page, it said, because, you know, it's going to produce an industry and all this kind of stuff, jobs. And in the last page, it said, even if an industry does not develop, we will have had a revenue stream. It est 50 million coming from the feds, which is why we've got stuck with this. And no other reason.
Gail,
Yes.
sorry, I'm down to 4 minutes.
Okay, that's it. I'm done.
Between me and 8 o'clock. So can we move on?
I'm
Are you
done.
almost done? Oh,
done.
you're done. Okay. Thank you.
I just had to put that
All
punchline
right.
in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gail. Yeah, and we'll move right on to Marilyn. As Marilyn's, you all know, chair of the Kitchener-Waterloo chapter, is also a board member for the Council of Canadians for Quebec, Ontario, and Nunavut. So if you want to wrap this up for us, we could squeeze in a few questions at the end.
Well, we've been answering questions as they've come up, Ian. So far we're on top of them.
Awesome. You guys are
So
great.
it's all in the chat. And if people want to save the chat, because you may not have had a chance to watch everything that's going through, there's a lot of great sources there and links, as well as answers to questions that have come up as we've gone along. One of the things I want to stress as we come to the end of this is that we have one chance right now. Between now and April 2nd, we have one chance to maybe stop this juggernaut, because their Achilles heel is the waste. And NRCan has finally come out with a policy, a draft policy, for how they'll manage this waste that is wholly inadequate. Just to give you an idea of how much they're not regulating and need to regulate, the industry defines the levels of toxicity of what is low, intermediate, and high level of toxicity. The industry decides when they're going to transport and where and how, and they do not alert local cities, municipalities, and so on when they're coming through with this waste. There's no chance to be prepared in the case of accident. How much waste are we talking about? well, just to give you some graphic, they say it's very small. We've got little bits of waste, and we put them in these fire log size pieces to keep them secure. We have 3 million of those pieces so far, those fire logs, and you could fill 8 hockey rinks from ice to the top of the boards with these current waste that's developed over the last 60 years that they haven't been able to figure out how to get rid of safely and securely. And we're going to have another 1.5 million of them before they finish the current processing of the current nuclear plants. This is going to take about 90,000 truckloads moving just the toxic waste to wherever they decide if we're going to have a deep geological repository. That's a lot of trucks coming through the towns en route to these locations, whichever one gets chosen. And now my internet's unstable, so I hope I don't freeze on you. But what I want to do is point out in the chat that I put in the link to a letter that all of us can sign. And please go to that link. And please, this has been developed by Council of Canadians. And it sets out 6 of the things that we're insisting on, if you will, that this policy must address if they're going to look after the health, safety, and security and protection of our environment, if they're going to be open, transparent, and in terms of public engagement, and if they're going to have global excellence in the field of radioactive waste management and decommissioning, which is all of what they have made as key commitments in their own draft policy. So the first is people have already identified as we've gone along. The independent regulatory agency is critical because we've been so corporate captured that we need somebody who's separate from all of this to take an honest look at it again. We need, as Ian and others have pointed out, perpetual care. This waste is toxic from anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million years. Yeah. And it cannot simply be put away and forgotten. There needs to be a way of perpetual monitoring on a regular basis so that as new technology and so forth comes on, we can take another look at how we manage it into the future. I find it staggering that we're thinking of having something that lasts for 1 million years. I mean, Homo sapiens have only been wandering around for about 350,000 years. This is staggering that they just very blithely say, oh, we can handle this waste, not a problem. And that's before we get to the SMR waste. We also want to make sure that there's guidance on the health and ecological problems around the mining and milling waste that Ken pointed out, because this is going on generationally as well. We need the government and the industry to be transparent in the management of the waste transportation so that local communities know that this is coming through and can be prepared in the event of accident. We need to ensure that Indigenous and non-Indigenous both have the right to access the information to make decisions about what's going to be happening in their and around their communities, that they know the risks, that they have reasonable consent from the whole community, traditional leaders, as well as elected in council. This is vital. During the parliamentary testimony, one of the chiefs pointed out that when they asked for information, the industry representative said, oh, we could give you all the information you want, but you'll never understand it. I mean, really? This is the way they're talked to? Anyway, we need to ensure that we forbid the importation of waste. And here we're talking about the cobalt-60. It is highly toxic. And the policy currently waffles on this, and it needs to be crystal clear. Any country in the world can buy this stuff and use it, and it has really good uses medically. I'm not debating that, but we should not be transporting it back and forth across the ocean and back and forth across our country. Simply sales technique. And finally, it was on in perpetuity. They've had 60 years of nuclear energy here in Canada, and they have not been able to deal with this intractable problem. They don't have a solution. It just keeps getting pushed down the road. And even the deep geological repositories, if we go that way, as Anne has pointed out, will take 50 years to build them. We're talking about a minimum of about 100 square meters of space underground, 100,000 square meters, in order to space all of this stuff. Digging it out and putting it in, monitoring it. And we have to just hope that that Canadian shield stays immobile over the course of millennia, over the course of 1 million years. And who can predict that? So this is the one thing we've got right now, is to insist that they come to grips with dealing with the waste before they make more of it, before they go into new kinds of waste like the plutonium and so on, similar to plutonium, not quite plutonium, in the SMRs. So I implore you, go to that council.org location, sign that document to NRCan, share it widely with your chapter members, ask them to share with their families and friends and colleagues. We want to blitz this and get this into NRCan with a very strong voice from across this country, that we've read their policy. It's not good enough. It needs to be a lot better. Okay, I'm 5 minutes over. We probably still have a little bit of time if there are questions, but I want to thank again everyone who was here to share all of this information. There's a ton of it, as you can see, and it takes a lot to winnow it down to where we were today. Again, I can only stress we have a short window. We all recognize that there are critical issues with nuclear, but waste is the only lever we have to slow the juggernaut and say, what you're doing isn't good enough. You need to protect the people of Canada. You need to protect our environment in perpetuity, because that's how long this stuff lasts.
Thank you, Marilyn. That was an excellent, quick review and overview, because that was a ton of information. So thank you, everyone, for being patient. If folks want to stick around, some of us will stick around to answer a few questions. Thank you for the people who are answering questions in the chat while I was not looking at it. So that was excellent. And yes, we'll make sure that we get the chat. I'm saying we, which I really mean V. We'll get the text out of the chat, and hopefully any questions that are in there that have not been answered will be answered. But if someone wants to jump in real quick and ask someone in particular a burning question, we've got a couple of minutes for that. And if not, thank you very much, everyone. Anybody out there? We're getting all sorts of thank yous in the chat, so thank you for that. Okay, I am going to suggest that you guys, and this is the school teacher, I teach at a college, you guys are all free to go now. Thank you for attending class. It was very nice to have you. The assignment will be posted in Brightspace and will be expected 1 week from today. Oh no, what was the date, Marilyn? Was it April? That's the assignment. That's perfect.
It's April 2nd, but the sooner we can get those signed documents in, and please, again, with what Mark and V and the people in comms have pulled together for us, feel free to add your own words based on what you've heard today and the impact it's had on you. I do that. I lead on with, this is what I want to say to you, and I endorse everything below, so that they know that it's not just a rubber stamp, if you will. But please get those letters in. They're vital to us. And if there's, we'll be looking at other things that we may be able to do, like letters to the editor and so on. But for now, that's where we can make our mark.
Take care, everyone.